It all started with a tomato. Not just any tomato, mind you. This was the tomato that launched 1,000 honking cars, dethroned a suburban queen, and turned me, Leo Maxwell, a recently and unceremoniously unemployed UX designer, into a local folk hero. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the traffic jam and the TV crews, before the cops and the contractors, before the great zucchini wars of Elm Street, there was just me, a patch of useless grass, and a very, very bad idea. Well, bad for some people. For me, it was the best idea I'd ever had. The email that ended my career arrived on a Tuesday. It was a masterpiece of corporate non-communication, a haiku of HR-approved cowardice. The subject line was an optimistic and utterly dishonest, exciting new directions. The body of the email talked about synergizing our core competencies, optimizing our workflow for a leaner future, and other phrases that meant exactly one thing. My login credentials would stop working in about 5 minutes. I had been optimized. My 10 years of designing intuitive user interfaces had been synergized right into the digital trash heap. The email was so sterile it could have been used to sanitize a hospital. It didn't even have the decency to sound apologetic. For the first 2 weeks, I was adrift in a sea of sweatpants and streaming services. I told myself I was decompressing. I told my wife, Jenna, that I was strategizing my next move. In reality, I was engaged in a prolonged battle of wills with the sourdough starter on our kitchen counter, a bubbling jar of goo that seemed to have more ambition than I did. I'd spend hours scrolling through job postings, each one demanding a rock star designer or a coding ninja. I was neither. I was a 38-year-old guy who was really good at making sure the checkout button was in a place people could find it without having a meltdown. It didn't feel very rock star. One afternoon, Jenna, who as a nurse has the patience of a saint and the no-nonsense attitude of a drill sergeant, found me staring blankly at the TV. "Leo," she said, gently prying the remote from my hand. "You need a project." "I have a project," I mumbled, gesturing at the belligerent sourdough. "It's called Operation Stop the Kitchen from Smelling Like a Brewery." "I mean a real project, something that doesn't involve yeast, something to get you out of the house, away from this," she said, waving a hand at my general state of decay. She was right, of course. She usually is. I needed something tangible, something that didn't require a password and two-factor authentication just to feel like you existed. I shuffled to the front window and stared out at the painfully perfect streetscape of the estates at Maple Creek. Every lawn was a chemically enhanced green carpet. Every shrub was trimmed into a perfect, soulless sphere. It was a neighborhood built by a committee that believed creativity was a fire hazard, and then I saw it. My patch of defiance. The hell strip. That pathetic 4-foot-wide ribbon of grass between the sidewalk and the street. It was technically my property, but it served no purpose other than being a nuisance to Mao. It was useless, forgotten, and overlooked. A bit like me, I thought. And that's when the idea hit. It arrived not like a lightning bolt, but more like a single stubborn weed pushing its way through concrete. I wasn't just going to plant a few flowers. I was going to grow food. Right there. In the front yard. For God and everyone. And especially the HOA. To see. It was productive. It was real. It was everything my old job wasn't. I turned to Jenna, a wild, unfamiliar grin spreading across my face. "I've got it," I announced. "I'm going to become a farmer." Jenna looked from me to the tiny patch of grass and back again. "A vegetable garden? In the front yard? Are you sure that's allowed?" "Allowed?" I scoffed, already feeling a surge of purpose. "It's dirt, Jen. It's our dirt. What are they gonna do? Ticket me for excessive deliciousness." Famous last words. I attacked the hell strip with the manic energy of a man who had just discovered his life's purpose. or at the very least, a fantastic new way to procrastinate looking for a job. My first act as a farmer was an attempt to reroute a sprinkler head. This resulted in me accidentally decapitating it with a shovel, creating a geyser of chlorinated water that shot 20 feet into the air and soaked a passing poodle. The poodle's owner was not amused. It was an inauspicious start. My next stop was the local hardware superstore. I wandered the aisles, utterly bewildered. I needed soil. Simple, right? Wrong. There was topsoil, potting soil, garden soil, lawn soil. There were bags promising moisture control, and others boasting of organic humus. One of them just said loam in big, confident letters. Is loam a real word? Or something they made up to charge me more? I ended up buying 10 bags of something called Premium Garden Blend, mostly because the guy on the bag looked happy, and I desperately wanted to absorb some of that vibe. Building the raised beds was a battle against my own incompetence. My hands, softened by a decade of keyboard clicks and trackpad swipes, were soon covered in blisters and splinters. My lines weren't straight. My corners weren't square. The finished product looked less like a professional garden box and more like a wooden parallelogram that had survived a natural disaster. But it was mine. I filled the crooked boxes with my premium soil, arranged my seedlings with the precision of a bomb disposal expert, and gave them their first watering. I had 6 tomato plants, 4 zucchini, a row of kale that looked suspiciously like weeds, and some basil. And then I waited. To my profound shock, things started to grow. Tiny green shoots pushed their way toward the sun, leaves unfurled. It was a miracle of biology, and I was its clumsy, astonished shepherd. I started talking to my plants, offering them words of encouragement. I named the most promising-looking tomato plant, a sturdy little guy in the corner, Big Tony. He had moxie. The garden became my sanctuary. I'd spend hours out there, pulling weeds, checking for pests, and just watching. I loved the earthy smell of the soil after a light rain, the rough texture of a tomato leaf between my fingers, the vibrant, impossible green of it all. I was getting a ridiculous farmer's tan. My fingernails were permanently dirty, and I hadn't felt this happy in years. Neighbors I'd only ever offered a curt nod to would now stop and chat. Most were curious, some even encouraging. It was a novelty in our neighborhood of suffocating uniformity. My little rebellion was alive, and it was growing. It was perfect. And because it was perfect, I should have known it was all about to go horribly, horribly wrong. The serpent in my Garden of Eden arrived in a pristine white SUV that hummed with the silent, judgmental purr of an electric engine. It glided to a stop in front of my house, and out stepped Carol Becker, president of the estates at Maple Creek Homeowners Association. Carol was a woman who looked like she was assembled from a catalog of high-end suburban leisure wear. Today she was in crisp beige yoga pants, a matching beige zip-up, and sneakers so white they looked like they had been crafted from pure light. She carried a clipboard like it was a royal scepter, and her smile was a triumph of modern dentistry, surgically precise and completely devoid of warmth. I was on my knees, admiring a new leaf on Big Tony, when her shadow fell over me. "Well, hello there," she chirped, the sound like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Carol," I said, getting to my feet and wiping my dirt-covered hands on my shorts. "What's up?" "Oh, just doing my rounds," she said, her eyes scanning my glorious, chaotic garden with thinly veiled horror. "It's certainly vibrant, what you're doing here. Quite the project." "Thanks," I said, puffing my chest out a little. "Just trying to liven the place up. Grow a little something fresh." "I see," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. She made a little tick mark on a sheet on her clipboard. "It's just that I wanted to gently remind you of the community aesthetic we all strive to uphold." The covenants are rather specific about front-facing landscaping. We wouldn't want things to get out of hand, would we? She said the words community aesthetic as if they were a sacred creed. I looked at my beautiful, life-filled garden. I looked at the sterile green desert of her lawn across the street. Out of hand? I replied, forcing a chuckle. Carol, they're zucchini. Their big plan for world domination involves ending up in a nice ratatouille. I think we're safe. The smile on her face tightened by a millimeter, a tectonic shift in the landscape of her serene expression. Of course, she said. Just a friendly reminder. It's important to maintain our standards. It protects our property values, you know. She made another note on her clipboard, gave me a final, dazzlingly empty smile, and glided back to her silent white vessel. As she drove away, I was left with a cold knot in my stomach. That wasn't a friendly reminder. That was a warning shot, and it was aimed directly at Big Tony. A week passed. The sun shone, the zucchini blossomed, and Big Tony began to produce tiny green spheres that held the promise of future bruschetta. I almost convinced myself that Carol's visit had been a fluke, a mere twitch of the neighborhood's overbearing nervous system. I was, of course, a complete idiot. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came in a beige envelope made of cardstock so thick and luxurious you could probably stop a bullet with it. In the top left corner, embossed in gaudy gold foil, were the words, "The Estates at Maple Creek Homeowners Association." My heart sank. This was not a friendly neighborhood newsletter. I tore it open, my hand suddenly clammy. The letter was short, brutal, and swimming in legalese. It informed me that I, Leo Maxwell, resident of 124 Elm Street, was in direct violation of the HOA covenants, specifically Article 4, Section 2B, which I soon learned by heart. All front-facing yard areas, including but not limited to the area between the public sidewalk and the street, must be predominantly covered in pre-approved species of turf grass and/or ornamental, non-fruit-bearing flora. Non-fruit-bearing flora? They had weaponized botany against me. "You have got to be kidding me," I said to the empty room. I read the letter again. It wasn't a joke. It went on to say that I had 14 days to remediate the violation. Failure to comply would result in daily fines of $50, which would be placed as a lien against my property if unpaid. That night, I read the letter aloud to Jenna, performing it with the dramatic gravitas of a Shakespearean tragedy. "Non-fruit-bearing flora," I bellowed, pacing the kitchen. "They're legislating against tomatoes. This is un-American. It's a violation of my pursuit of happiness and my pursuit of a decent caprese salad." Jenna, ever the pragmatist, put her hand on my arm. "Leo, calm down. It's annoying, but can't you just move the plants to the backyard? We have plenty of space back there." "Move them," I cried, aghast. "Jenna, this is not about the location of the vegetables anymore. This is about the principle of the thing. This is about freedom. This is about a woman named Carol who has the audacity to tell me that my tomatoes are aesthetically displeasing. The line must be drawn here. This far, no further." I may have been paraphrasing a Star Trek captain, but the sentiment was pure. Jenna sighed, a sound I knew well. It was her "my husband has a new insane obsession" sigh. "So what are you going to do?" "What any red-blooded patriotic American would do," I declared, waving the beige letter. "I'm going to appeal. I'm taking this fight to the HOA." The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center's multi-purpose room, a place that sucked the life and joy out of any purpose you could imagine. The lighting was a flickering fluorescent yellow that made everyone look vaguely ill. The air smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation. A dozen of my fellow residents were scattered amongst the folding chairs, looking about as thrilled to be there as they would be for a root canal. At the front of the room, Behind a long, folding table sat the HOA board. There was Carol, of course, presiding over the proceedings with the smug serenity of a dictator. To her right sat Gary, a retired Marine with a flat-top haircut who seemed to believe all neighborhood issues, from patchy lawns to speeding minivans, could be solved with better discipline and more acronyms. To her left was a woman named Brenda, who was knitting a beige scarf and appeared to have achieved a state of zen-like detachment from the proceedings. I had prepared. I had a speech. I had 4x6 glossy photos of my garden. I even had a small handout with bullet points on the environmental benefits of hyper-local agriculture. I was ready. When my agenda item was called, I walked to the flimsy lectern with my heart pounding. I gave my speech. I spoke of community, of sustainability, of the simple joy of growing something with your own hands. I talked about the neighbors who stopped to chat, the kids who were fascinated by the growing plants. I even got a little choked up when I talked about Big Tony. I thought it was a pretty good speech. A few people in the audience even nodded along. When I finished, there was a smattering of polite applause. I felt a glimmer of hope. Then Carol spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell, for that passionate presentation," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She didn't look at any notes. She didn't need to. "While the board appreciates your enthusiasm, we have to consider the bigger picture. We are a community of standards. These standards, which are clearly outlined in the covenants that we all agreed to when we purchased our homes, are what protect our property values." She paused, letting the words property values hang in the air like a sacred mantra. "What you see as a charming rebel garden, Mr. Maxwell, the board sees as a precedent. If we allow a vegetable garden in your front yard, what's next? Corn stalks? A chicken coop? A goat?" She said the word goat as if it were a profanity. "It's a slippery slope. We have a responsibility to maintain the uniform, pleasing aesthetic that makes the estates at Maple Creek such a desirable place to live. The rules are the rules for a reason." She looked at Gary. "Gary?" Gary leaned into his microphone. "The CSSRs are clear. Case closed. Oorah." Carol looked at Brenda. Brenda looked up from her knitting, blinked slowly, and said, "I agree with Carol." "The board has voted," Carol announced, her voice filled with finality. "The appeal is denied. You have 14 days to remediate the violation, Mr. Maxwell. Next item on the agenda, a discussion on approved mailbox colors." I stood there for a moment, my glossy photos feeling flimsy and stupid in my hand. I had lost. I walked back to my seat, the weight of the beige, soulless, goat-fearing bureaucracy crushing me. The next day was one of the bleakest of my adult life. I moped. I sighed dramatically. I stared out the window at my beautiful, condemned garden. Big Tony's first tomato was just starting to blush from green to a pale orange. It was like watching a beautiful movie that you knew was about to have a terrible, unjust ending. Jenna tried to cheer me up. "We can build an even better garden in the back," she promised. "A huge one. We'll have so many tomatoes Carol will be able to see them from space." It was a nice thought, but it didn't help. It wasn't about the tomatoes anymore. It was about the fact that I had been beaten. Beaten by beige. That evening, defeated, I sat at my desk with the HOA Covenant Handbook, a document as thick as a phone book and as riveting as a tax code. I was torturing myself, reading through the endless list of things I wasn't allowed to do. No sheds over a certain height. No basketball hoops left out overnight. No unapproved shades of off-white for your trim. I flipped back to Article 4, Section 2B, the source of all my pain. I read the words over and over again. Predominantly covered in pre-approved species of turf grass and/or ornamental, non-fruit-bearing flora. Non-fruit-bearing flora. The rule was about what could be planted in the soil. It was about what could grow there. And then a tiny, mischievous neuron fired in the darkest corner of my brain. It connected with another and another. A beautiful, petty, magnificent idea began to form. The rules forbade growing vegetables in my front yard. They said nothing about displaying them. They said nothing about distributing them. They said nothing about building a charming, adorable, monumentally annoying farm stand right where my garden used to be. I scanned the entire document. I used the search function on the PDF version. Not a single mention of stands, stalls, kiosks, or charitable distribution of produce. The omission was so glaring it was practically an invitation. A slow grin spread across my face. The first genuine smile I'd had in days. I felt a jolt of energy, a surge of defiant creativity I hadn't felt since my best days as a designer. I had found a loophole. A glorious, beautiful loophole. I walked into the living room where Jenna was reading. She looked up, concerned by the manic glint in my eye. "They want me to get rid of my vegetables," I said, my voice low and theatrical. "Leo, we knew this was a possibility," she said gently. "We'll just build a bigger garden in the back." "Oh, I'm going to get rid of them," I said, my grin widening. "I'm going to get rid of them so fast it'll make Carol's head spin. But first, I need to go to the hardware store. And the craft store." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "The craft store? Why?" "I'm going to need a lot of paint," I said. "And maybe some googly eyes." Phase 1 of Operation Petty Produce began the next morning. With a heavy heart, I complied with the letter of the law. I carefully dug up my beloved plants, Big Tony, the zucchini, the kale, and transplanted them to a new, hastily prepared plot in the backyard. It felt like moving my children to a new school in the dead of night. Then, I rolled out fresh sod over the now empty beds on the hell strip. By lunchtime, my front yard was once again a featureless, HOA-approved expanse of green. I even took a picture and emailed it to the HOA management company with the subject line, "Violation remediated. Have a beige day." Phase 2 began in my home office. I fired up my old design software and channeled my corporate-fueled angst into a new project. On a giant digital whiteboard, I storyboarded my masterpiece. This wasn't just revenge. This was a user experience. The user, my long-suffering neighbors. The goal? To provide them with delightful, free produce, while simultaneously driving Carol Becker slowly and completely insane. The centerpiece of the plan was the stand itself. A flimsy card table wouldn't do. That was amateur-level spite. No, this had to be a work of art. It had to be so charming, so wholesome, so aggressively adorable that to complain about it would be like complaining about a basket of kittens. I designed a miniature red barn, complete with a green tin roof, white trim, and a little cutout window. It would have a chalkboard for announcing the day's offerings and small flower boxes on the sides, filled with approved, non-fruit-bearing petunias, of course. It was a caricature of rustic charm, a Disney-fied vision of farm life plopped down in the middle of suburban hell. Crucially, my design specified that it would sit on top of the grass, not be fixed into the ground. It would be a temporary, non-permanent structure. I had spent 3 hours scouring the bylaws for regulations on such things. The only rule was that it couldn't be over 6 feet tall and couldn't be left out for more than 90 consecutive days. My barn was 5'11". I would move it a single inch every 89 days. Check and mate. I presented my detailed multi-page design document to Jenna that evening. She stared at the 3D rendering on my laptop screen, her expression a perfect mixture of horror and awe. "You're building a barn," she said flatly. "A tiny barn, on the hell strip." "It's a produce distribution kiosk, according to my official plans," I corrected her, puffing out my chest. And it's technically a temporary, non-permanent structure designed to foster community engagement and reduce food waste. I checked the bylaws, Jen. Loophole, baby. She shook her head, but I could see a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. You're a menace, Leo Maxwell. I'm a user experience designer, I replied, and Carol is about to have a very, very bad user experience. While I could design a barn, my practical carpentry skills were limited to assembling IKEA furniture, a process that usually ended with me cursing in Swedish and having at least 3 leftover screws. If my kiosk was going to be a masterpiece of malicious compliance, I needed a professional. My search for a contractor was an adventure in itself. The first guy who came out was Slick Rick, a young man in a branded polo shirt who smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. He looked at my plans, his eyes glazing over. Yeah, we can do this, he said, already tapping on his tablet. But have you considered a composite material, low maintenance, and we could install some solar-powered accent lighting, really make it pop at night. You'll be the talk of the neighborhood. Rick, I said patiently, the point is to be annoying, not to increase my property value. He didn't get it. He kept trying to upsell me on a revenue-positive venture. I sent him packing. The second contractor was a man named Gus. The online reviews described him as gruff but fair. He arrived in a beat-up Ford Ranger that looked like it had personally survived several wars. Gus himself was in his late 60s, with a face like a road map of every job site he'd ever been on, and hands that looked like they could crush granite. He didn't say much, just took the printouts of my plans and studied them in silence for a long, long minute. He looked from the paper to the pristine patch of sod where the garden used to be, then back to the paper. Finally, he looked at me, a toothpick working its way from one side of his mouth to the other. Let me get this straight, he said, his voice a low rumble. You want me to build a dollhouse barn on this patch of grass so you can give away cucumbers? And tomatoes, I added. And zucchini, for free, primarily to annoy the lady in the beige SUV across the street. Gus stared at me. The toothpick stopped moving. For a second, I thought he was going to laugh in my face and leave. Instead, a slow, magnificent grin spread across his weathered face, revealing a lifetime of appreciating pure, unadulterated shenanigans. I'll get my tools, he said. I like your style, kid. Gus and I built the stand that weekend. He worked with a quiet, efficient skill that was mesmerizing to watch, while I served as his clumsy but enthusiastic assistant. I passed him tools, held boards steady, and provided a steady stream of coffee and donuts. We talked about his grandkids, my layoff, and the universal evils of overzealous neighborhood associations. He told me about a guy who hired him to build a 30-foot flagpole just to block his neighbor's view of the sunset. He was a connoisseur of petty construction. By Sunday afternoon, it was finished. It was perfect. A ridiculous, bright red beacon of charm, sitting proudly on the very spot where my garden had been murdered. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever helped build. The following Saturday was the grand opening. I woke up with the nervous energy of a Broadway actor on opening night. My backyard garden, now thriving in its new location, had produced a modest but respectable first harvest. Big Tony's tomatoes were blushing beautifully. To supplement, I'd made a trip to the local farmer's market at dawn and bought 2 crates of the freshest produce I could find. I arranged the offerings in quaint wicker baskets inside the stand's little window. Ruby red tomatoes, deep green zucchini, bunches of fragrant basil. It looked like a picture from a country living magazine. Using my best calligraphy, I wrote on the chalkboard, "The Maple Creek Free Produce Stand." Below that, I added, "Take what you need, leave what you can." and at the very bottom, a little chef's kiss of pettiness. Because some things are more important than turf grass. I also placed a sealed mason jar with a slot in the lid and a small sign that read, "If you feel so inclined, all donations go to the county food bank." This wasn't just spite. This was weaponized wholesomeness. Then, I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee and waited. At first, the reaction was confusion. Cars slowed down as they passed, drivers craning their necks. A few joggers stopped, read the signs, and continued on, looking bewildered. My first customer was an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable from down the street. She peered at the stand, then at me. "Is this for real, Leo?" she asked. It's free?" "Absolutely," I said with a grand wave. "Help yourself." She took 2 tomatoes, her eyes shining. "That's just lovely," she said, before dropping a crinkled dollar bill into the donation jar. Slowly, more people came. A young mom with 2 kids in a wagon took a zucchini, promising to make zucchini bread. A teenage boy on a skateboard grabbed a handful of basil, saying he was going to try making his own pesto. It was working. It was more than working. It was wonderful. And then I saw it. The silent white SUV cruising down the street at a funeral pace. It stopped directly in front of my house. The tinted window rolled down, and I saw Carol Becker inside, sunglasses on, staring at my creation. I knew she was running through her mental copy of the bylaws, searching for the violation. She was looking at the structure, the signs, the people, and she was finding nothing. It was a temporary structure. I wasn't conducting a business. I wasn't selling anything. I was, by all appearances, simply a kind, community-minded citizen sharing his bounty. I raised my coffee mug in a cheerful toast and gave her my biggest, most sincere wave. The look on her face was a symphony of conflicting emotions. Pure, unadulterated fury, warring with utter confusion and the cold, dawning horror of impotence. It was more beautiful and satisfying than any sunset I had ever seen. The window rolled up, and the SUV silently glided away. The zucchini wars had officially begun. My little red stand didn't stay a secret for long. In a neighborhood as tightly wound and gossip-fueled as the estates at Maple Creek, it was the equivalent of a UFO landing on the community tennis court. First came the whispers, then the texts, and then, inevitably, the Facebook post. It was posted by a neighbor, Sharon, in the Maple Creek Community Forum, a private group that was usually a battleground for arguments about dog poop and teenagers parking in the wrong spots. Sharon posted a picture of the stand, baskets overflowing with colorful produce. The caption read, "Has anyone seen this adorable free produce stand on Elm Street? The guy who runs it is the sweetest. Such a wonderful addition to our community." The post exploded. Within hours, it had over 200 likes and dozens of comments. "OMG, I love this. What a great idea. My kids and I picked up a zucchini yesterday. We made muffins. Thank you, Mystery Vegetable Man. This is the kind of neighborhood spirit we need more of." I became, to my astonishment, a local celebrity, the Mystery Vegetable Man. People didn't just take produce anymore. They started contributing. A retired man named Dave, who had an entire jungle of a garden in his backyard, started dropping off bags of green beans. Another woman left a bundle of fresh mint with a little note tied to it. The stand became a self-sustaining ecosystem of neighborhood generosity. It was everything the HOA claimed to be about: community, sharing, civic pride. But it was real, and it was happening on my hell strip. Of course, this explosion of goodwill was, to Carol Becker, the equivalent of a personal declaration of war. She couldn't attack the stand itself. It was legally airtight. So she began a campaign of guerrilla warfare. Her first move was to file a formal complaint about organic debris. Apparently, a single tomato leaf had fluttered from the stand onto the pristine public sidewalk, creating what she described in her email as a potential slip hazard and unsightly blight. The HOA management company sent me a courtesy warning. I responded by buying a tiny, child-sized broom and dustpan and leaving them propped against the stand with a sign that said, Official Debris Management Station. Next, she lodged a complaint about pests. The stand, she claimed, was attracting ants, which posed a clear and present danger to the foundational integrity of nearby homes. I countered by buying a set of eco-friendly, non-toxic ant traps and placing them in a neat defensive perimeter around the stand. I labeled them the Ant HOA Defense System. I was having the time of my life. Every beige envelope that arrived in my mailbox, every passive-aggressive email, was a fresh log on the fire of my righteous pettiness. I was no longer just the unemployed guy with a sourdough problem. I was Leo Maxwell, the rebel of Elm Street, the zucchini general. And my enemy, bless her beige heart, was about to make a critical mistake. She was going to call in reinforcements. The police cruiser rolled up on a Wednesday afternoon. It didn't use its sirens, just glided to the curb with the quiet authority that made the entire neighborhood poke their heads out of their windows. 2 officers got out. One was young, with a fresh-out-of-the-academy haircut and an expression of serious concentration. The other was older, with a magnificent mustache and the weary, seen-it-all eyes of a man who had responded to one too many calls about cats stuck in trees. I was restocking the stand with some lovely-looking bell peppers when they approached. I saw Carol watching from her window across the street, a phantom silhouette behind the blinds. This was her big play. "Afternoon, sir," said the young officer, Miller. He had a notepad out. "We received a call about, He glanced at his notes, a look of embarrassment flickering across his face. A potential disturbance? Disturbance? Officer, the only thing being disturbed here is the myth that you can't get good, free kale in the suburbs, I said, gesturing to the stand. I decided my best strategy was overwhelming. Folksy charm. "Can I interest you gentlemen in some peppers? Great for grilling." The older officer, Russo, whose name tag I could now see, ignored his partner and eyed the stand with a connoisseur's appreciation. "So you're just giving this stuff away?" he asked, his voice a gravelly baritone. "Yes, sir. All free. No charge. Take what you need. Help yourself." "The cherry tomatoes are fantastic today," I chirped. Just then, as if on cue, Carol's front door opened and she marched across the street, her power-walking stride filled with purpose. She had her scepter clipboard in hand. "Officers," she announced, her voice sharp and commanding, "thank you for coming. This man is creating a public nuisance. He is attracting loiterers, creating potential traffic hazards, and operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise." Russo turned his gaze from the tomatoes to Carol. He seemed entirely unimpressed. "Ma'am, is he selling anything?" he asked calmly. "No, but," Carol began. "Is he blocking the public sidewalk?" Russo interrupted. "Well, no, but the principle of the matter. Is he forcing anyone to take these vegetables against their will?" Carol sputtered, momentarily speechless. "That's absurd!" Russo nodded slowly, then turned back to me. He reached out, plucked a perfect ruby-red cherry tomato from a basket, and popped it into his mouth. He chewed thoughtfully for a moment. "You're right," he said, pointing at me with the stem. "That's a good tomato." He then looked at his partner. "Miller, I think our work here is done." He gave me a slight nod. "You have a good day, sir." As they walked back to their car, Russo grabbed a whole handful of tomatoes for the road. I watched them drive off, then looked over at Carol. She was standing on the sidewalk, her mouth slightly agape, her face a thunderous shade of red. She had called in an airstrike, and the pilots had ended up joining the enemy for lunch. I gave her a little wave. She spun on her heel and retreated back into her beige fortress. The zucchini wars weren't over, but I had just won a major battle. My victory with the police seemed to break something in Carol. Her tactics shifted from bureaucratic warfare to a campaign of pure, unadulterated passive aggression. The arms race began. Her first move was to start parking her enormous white SUV directly in front of the stand every morning, positioning it perfectly to block the view from the street and make it awkward for people to stop. It was a masterful act of vehicular spite. I retaliated. That evening, I printed out a new, beautifully designed sign on foam core. It featured a large, friendly arrow pointing directly at her SUV. The text read, "Free produce. Don't let this large, inconveniently parked vehicle stop you from enjoying delicious, free vegetables." I propped it up on the grass right in front of her bumper. The next morning, I saw her staring at it from her window for a full 10 minutes before furiously backing her car into her driveway. Score one for me. Her next move came 2 days later. She had a team of landscapers install a new set of industrial-strength floodlights on the front of her house. That night, my little red barn was illuminated by a beam of light so intense it felt like I was living next to a maximum security prison. The light flooded my living room window. This called for an escalation. The next day, I went to an auto parts store and bought a large roll of the shiniest, most reflective window tinting film they had. Under the cover of darkness, I carefully applied it to the entire back wall of the stand, the side facing her house. That night, when her prison floodlights switched on, they hit the mirrored surface and bounced a significant portion of their blinding glare right back at her house, illuminating her front windows in an ethereal, annoying glow. I watched from my darkened living room as her lights flickered off, then on, then off again for good. It was a thing of beauty. The neighborhood was, of course, eating it up. It was live theater. People would change their jogging routes to pass by my house just to see the latest development in the standoff on Elm Street. My little project had become more than a source of free vegetables. It was a source of top-tier suburban entertainment, and the grand finale was going to be even better than I could have possibly imagined. The story, like a dandelion seed, floated on the digital winds of the local internet until it landed in fertile ground. The inbox of Chloe Evans, a young, ambitious reporter for the local TV station's website. Chloe ran a segment called The Bright Side, which focused on quirky, feel-good stories from around the community. A tale of suburban vegetable-based rebellion was, apparently, right up her alley. She called me on a Thursday, her voice bubbly and enthusiastic. She'd seen the Facebook post and heard the rumors. She wanted to know if she could come by with a camera crew. "A camera crew?" I asked, suddenly nervous. "Isn't that a bit much? It's just a little red stand." "Oh no," she chirped. "Our readers love this stuff. A little guy fighting back against a stuffy HOA? It's David versus Goliath, but with zucchini, it's perfect." I couldn't argue with that logic. They came by the next morning. Chloe was even more energetic in person, and her cameraman, a stoic guy named Ben, orbited her silently. Chloe was a pro. She made me feel completely at ease as I told the whole story, from the layoff and the Hellstrip garden to Carol's reign of terror and the glorious loophole. I showed them the beige letter. I recounted the story of the police visit. I made sure to give Big Tony, now thriving in the backyard, a special on-camera mention. "So what's next for the free produce stand?" Chloe asked, pointing the microphone at me for the final question. I summoned my best folksy charm. "Well, Chloe," I said, leaning in conspiratorially, "the pride and joy of my garden, the crimson treasure heirloom tomatoes, are just about to ripen. They're my masterpieces. And I think this Saturday, right here at the stand, I'm going to be giving them all away. First come, first served." "You heard it here first," Chloe said, turning to the camera with a brilliant smile. A community hero sharing his crimson treasures. If you want a taste of victory, Elm Street is the place to be this Saturday. The segment went online that afternoon and was teased for the 6 p.m. broadcast. It was a masterpiece of local news schmaltz. They used dramatic, slow-motion shots of the Little Red Stand. They played uplifting, plucky music while I talked about community. And they used a photo of Carol, which they must have scraped from the HOA website, where she was smiling a smile so forced it looked like it was causing her physical pain. They identified her only as a concerned neighbor. The story was shared hundreds, then thousands of times. My phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends from high school I hadn't spoken to in 15 years were messaging me. "Dude, are you the vegetable guy?" I went to bed that night feeling a mixture of pride and a low-grade humming anxiety. I had a feeling Saturday was going to be a little busier than usual. I woke up on Saturday to the sound of a car door closing. It was 7:30 a.m. I peeked through the blinds and saw a minivan parked down the street. A woman was sitting in the driver's seat, reading a book, an early bird. By 8:30, there were 4 more cars. People were milling about on the sidewalk, chatting with each other. It felt like the line for a rock concert. I drank my coffee, my stomach doing nervous flip-flops. At 9 a.m., I took a deep breath and went to work. I carried out the baskets, stocking the stand to its absolute limit. And, in a place of honor, right in the center, I placed a large bowl of the most beautiful tomatoes I had ever grown. The crimson treasures. They were deep red, oddly shaped, and they shone in the morning sun like jewels. The moment I placed them in the stand, it was like a starting gun had fired. The small crowd surged forward, polite but determined. The first dozen tomatoes were gone in 60 seconds. But the crowd didn't disperse. It grew. More cars were arriving every minute. People I'd never seen before, from towns I'd only ever driven through, were parking and walking towards my house, drawn by the siren song of free tomatoes and televised suburban drama. By 10 a.m., the street was impassable. Cars were double parked on both sides. People, giving up on finding a spot, were simply abandoning their vehicles in the middle of the road, hazards blinking. The traffic on the main road at the end of our block was backing up as drivers slowed to gawk at the growing spectacle. It was no longer a queue. It was a festival. People were laughing, sharing stories, taking selfies with the Little Red Stand. Someone had brought a cooler of juice boxes for the kids. The atmosphere was one of pure, joyful chaos. I was in the middle of it all, a bewildered celebrity, handing out the last of my zucchini, shaking hands, and trying feebly to direct a minivan that was attempting a 17-point turn. Then things escalated further. A food truck, a bright yellow one that sold gourmet tacos, somehow managed to nose its way halfway down the block before getting completely, hopelessly stuck. The driver, a guy with a magnificent handlebar mustache, shrugged, killed the engine, opened his service window and started slinging carnitas to the assembled mob. The crowd roared with approval. A traffic jam. I had caused a genuine bona fide traffic jam. With vegetables. People were honking, but it wasn't angry honking. It was a chaotic, celebratory symphony of horns. I looked at the scene. The hundreds of people, the taco truck, the abandoned cars, the palpable sense of an entire community that had spontaneously decided to throw a block party in the middle of the street. And I couldn't help but laugh. This was my creation. This beautiful, magnificent mess was my fault. Through the happy din, I heard a sound that cut through the noise like a drill. It was the sound of a screen door slamming shut with the force of a thunderclap. And then I saw her. Carol Becker was marching out of her house, her face the color of my crimson treasures. Her beige athleisure wear seemed to vibrate with pure rage. This was her pristine, orderly street, her kingdom of covenants, and it had been transformed into a scene from a disaster movie directed by a clown. She did not take it well. "Get off the road!" she shrieked, but her voice was swallowed by the crowd. She started stomping towards the epicenter of the chaos. Me. People parted before her like the Red Sea, sensing the imminent eruption. She shoved her way through the taco line, ignoring the man who offered her a free al pastor. She had her phone out and was trying to take pictures of license plates, but her hands were shaking too much to get a clear shot. She finally reached me. I was standing next to Chloe, the reporter, who had, of course, returned with Ben, the cameraman, to document the pandemonium her story had created. The camera was rolling. "You!" Carol screamed, jabbing a finger at my chest. "This is all your fault. You are a menace to this neighborhood, a menace!" "Carol, take it easy," I said, holding my hands up in a placating gesture. "People are just having a good time." "A good time?" she screeched, her voice cracking. "This is chaos. This is anarchy. You have destroyed the sanctity of this community with your free kale." It was, I had to admit, a hell of an accusation. And then, in a final, glorious act of self-destruction, she lunged for the produce stand. Her intention, I think, was to tip it over, to destroy the symbol of her defeat. But the stand, lovingly built by Gus, was sturdier than it looked. Her hand slipped, and she stumbled, managing only to knock over an empty basket of zucchini. The crowd, which had been watching in stunned silence, finally reacted. A low boo started, then grew into a chorus. Someone chanted, "Leave! Leo! Alone!" And others joined in. Carol froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was being booed, in her own neighborhood, on her own street. It was too much. The carefully constructed facade of the calm, orderly HOA president shattered into a million pieces. She let out a wordless shriek of pure frustration, turned, and shoved her way back through the crowd towards her house. Just as she reached her lawn, Officer Russo's patrol car, which had been dispatched to deal with the major traffic incident, arrived. He got out, took in the scene with a single, weary glance, and intercepted Carol before she could make it inside. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, gently escorting the sputtering, shrieking woman to her front door. The entire meltdown, from the finger-jabbing to the failed stand-tipping to the police escort, was captured in glorious high definition by Ben's camera. Carol Becker's reign was officially, and very publicly, over. It took the rest of the afternoon for the great tomato traffic jam to untangle. Officer Russo, showing the patience of a saint, supervised the slow, complicated process of cars backing out of the street. The taco truck driver, whose name was Miguel, did a booming business and, before he finally managed to escape, presented me with a voucher for free tacos for life. "For services to chaos, my friend," he said with a wink. As the last of the cars departed, a strange thing happened. My neighbors, the residents of the estates at Maple Creek, didn't just retreat into their homes. They came out with brooms and trash bags. We cleaned up the street together, picking up stray napkins and taco wrappers. The mood wasn't tense or annoyed. It was celebratory, like the aftermath of a legendary party. Everyone had a story. Everyone had seen Carol's spectacular implosion. The news segment that night was devastating. Chloe Evans deserved an award. They aired the whole thing. My charming interview, the joyous chaos of the crowd, and, of course, the full, unedited footage of Carol's meltdown. They called it the Battle of the Beige. By Sunday morning, the clip had been picked up by national news aggregators and was going viral. My little neighborhood spat was now a national symbol of the fight against petty tyranny. The HOA's email inbox crashed from the sheer volume of angry messages they received from strangers across the country. An email went out to all residents on Sunday evening. The subject line, Emergency HOA Board Meeting Regarding Recent Events. It was on. The multi-purpose room on Tuesday night was a different world from the last meeting I'd attended. It was standing room only. The air, usually thick with apathy, was crackling with energy. This wasn't a meeting, it was a revolution. The board sat at the front table, minus one member. Carol's chair was conspicuously empty, Gary looked uncomfortable, and Brenda was knitting what appeared to be a beige surrender flag. The meeting was short and brutal. A motion was immediately made by a resident to remove Carol Becker as president, citing conduct unbecoming of a board member and general villainy, though the official motion was worded more diplomatically. The vote was nearly unanimous. She was out. Then, another motion was made to immediately amend Article 4, Section 2B of the Covenants. After a spirited 10-minute debate, the non-fruit-bearing flora clause was struck down. It was replaced with a new community garden proviso, which actively encouraged small-scale personal food gardens, provided they were kept neat and tidy. They even asked me to be on the ad hoc committee to help draft the specific language. Me, the former arch-criminal of the neighborhood. When the meeting was over, people clapped me on the back. They shook my hand. Mrs. Gable gave me a hug. I had gone from neighborhood pariah to founding father in the span of 72 hours. I stood at the lectern where I had made my failed, desperate plea just a few weeks earlier. I just want to say, I started, and the room fell silent. I just wanted to grow some tomatoes, that's all. But it turns out what grew instead was, well, this, you guys, and that's a whole lot better. It was cheesy, but it was true. Life on Elm Street found a new normal, a better one. The free produce stand remained, but it was now an officially sanctioned community exchange kiosk. Over the next few months, little green shoots of rebellion started popping up all over the neighborhood. The woman down the street planted a row of sunflowers along her driveway. A family on the next block built a beautiful raised bed for herbs. The estates at Maple Creek started to look less like a sterile corporate campus and more like a place where actual human beings lived. I never did go back to UX design. The news story brought a strange kind of fame, and people started reaching out to me for advice. I started a small consulting business from my home office called The Rebel Garden, helping people in other soul-crushing suburban enclaves plan and build their own little patches of defiance. I was busier and happier than I had ever been. One afternoon, a few months after the traffic jam, I was sitting on my porch watching the world go by. I saw kids ride their bikes past the little red stand, stopping to see if there was anything good today. And then I saw it. In front of Carol Becker's house, staked into the dead center of her perfect, immaculate, soulless lawn, was a for sale sign. I leaned back in my chair, picked up a crimson treasure tomato from a bowl on the table beside me, and took a bite. It was sweet and acidic, and tasted overwhelmingly of sunshine and victory. I looked at the for sale sign one more time, and then I looked at you, the imaginary audience who had followed this whole ridiculous journey. I gave a slow, satisfied wink. Who knew a little dirt could cause so much trouble?